Welcome back. You're listening to Patriarch, the retelling of the biblical story of Abraham by me, Colin Piper. And you've reached a real favourite episode of mine. To be honest, it's not exactly action-packed, but it does introduce a favourite character, Rebecca. And yes, I have over-egged this part of the story, but you've got this far, so I'm sure you can indulge me with just a little bit of romance. If you want to find out more, visit BibleNovels.com. And again, the Facebook group Bible Novels, and I'd love to hear your impressions. And please do share this with others. It's been wonderful to hear from folks how much they're enjoying it. And given that it's free, I'd love it to go as far as it possibly can and bless as many people as possible. Thank you. Patriarch, Chapter 8, Part 4. Eliezer didn't set out immediately. A servant of his rank and experience knew that a trip of this importance needed to be carefully planned, and a servant of his skill knew how to do just that. Consequently, the caravan which assembled early one morning was a sight to behold. Nothing had been left to chance, both in terms of the journey itself and the task to be performed on arrival. The dominant features of the party, which Abraham came to bless and send on its way, were the huge animals which knelt together in the foreground. Camels were a sign of great wealth, and Abraham had a great many of them, but he was about to say goodbye to 10 of his finest. This was extravagance in the extreme, and most other men would have begrudged giving away so much. Not Abraham, though. He gripped the arm of his trusted servant in undisguised appreciation. Eliezer truly understood. This was a caravan which needed to impress, and it surely would. But there was more. And Eliezer led his master to one of the camels and opened the pack, which was loaded seemingly precariously, but actually securely on its back. Inside resembled a treasure trove. There were all kinds of good things from his master's wealth, and again his master was delighted to wave it all goodbye. There was the usual chaos as servants scrambled upon or cajoled into life camels who reluctantly and clumsily got to their feet. The uninitiated would at times like this doubt whether such a party would make it out of the camp, let alone across nations. And yet from nowhere an order would always be found, and from somewhere the camels would summon up an unusual but rhythmic grace. Abraham had seen it many, many times before, and prayed over the party for safety en route and for success on arrival, before hastily waving them on their way. The sooner they went, the sooner they would return. The journey was a very long one, which largely retraced the first journey Abraham had embarked upon 65 years before. It took Eliezer through his hometown of Damascus, which he noticed was largely unchanged from the city he'd left those years before. From here, though, much of the territory was unknown to him, as indeed were the people. From the moment Abraham had asked him to go on this journey to the time he'd left, Abraham had briefed him constantly about what and who to expect to find in Haran. Abraham's brother Nahor had finally had children by his young wife Milcah, and ultimately lots of them. The unlikely named Uz and Buz were followed by Kemuel, whose son had become a very significant patriarch in the region. More sons followed: Kesed, Hasso, Pildash, Gidlab, and Bethuel. Some of these had since died, but between them they'd left plenty of other children from whom Abraham hoped a wife could be found for Isaac. Failing that, Abraham, with rather less enthusiasm, told of other sons his brothers had had, not by Milcah, and therefore, in Abraham's mind, not so legitimate. Tabor, Gaham, Tahash, Mahaha. These too probably had daughters, but Abraham's information about these was somewhat sketchier. Eliezer had plenty of time on the journey to reflect upon who he might meet, and equally intriguingly, how. Briefly, he was distracted by the sight of the Euphrates. It was a slow, ponderous and unattractive river in comparison with the Nile or even the Abana of his hometown, but he still stopped to take in the view. Not for long, though. Time was pressing and his journey had been long enough. He didn't fancy any more overnight travelling camps, and so he pressed on, thinking all the time about what he would do when he finally arrived at Haran. He could, of course, simply seek out Abraham's family and introduce himself and his business. The truth was, he could hardly fail in his purpose, given the riches he carried with him. Who wouldn't marry his daughter after such a wealthy man? He may live far away, but not only was he rich, he was family. On one level, it was all straightforward, but Eliezer knew that wasn't the level his master lived upon. The solemnity of the commission and of the oaths required more than a functionary response. It required a response of faith. But how was this faith to be exercised? The sun was setting behind him, and Haran stood before him. Time was short, but his mind no clearer. Eliezer called the caravan to a halt outside the town and ordered his servants to get the camels to kneel before the well. He might as well water them, while he thought. Ironically, he was surrounded by the women of Haran who'd come out to draw water. Any one of these could be the woman he sought. But how on earth would he know? He might have been a chief steward, but right now he was clueless. And so he prayed, silently and privately. O Lord, God of my master Abraham. In truth, he wasn't too used to exercising faith for himself in this way. Everything he did was in his master's name, even prayer. Give me success today, and show kindness to my master Abraham. And then, as he prayed, an idea came to him. See, I'm standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. There was only one way he knew how to speak to God, or a servant boy come to that. He was, after all, a functionary who preferred to say things as they were. May it be that when I say to a girl, please let down your jar so that I may have a drink, the German idea was growing rapidly in his mind now, and she says, drink, and I'll water your camels too. Let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. Amen. It all made sense now. He had asked nothing crazy of his God, but he had asked something out of the ordinary. These were thirsty camels, and there were 10 of them. Anyone offering to water them would be an unusual woman, to say the least. And more than that, one worthy of his master. The chief steward knew the value of a good servant, and he was pleased with the idea. By this, O Lord, I will know you have shown kindness to my master. The God of Eliezer was pleased with the idea as well. In fact, the woman he had in mind, he had already drawn to the well even before Eliezer had started praying, and she arrived at the well before he'd finished. Eleazar saw her in the crowd. She was dressed like any other woman and carried her jar on her shoulder, just like the others. But there was something different about her. Her clothing suggested the modesty of a virgin, but couldn't hide her beauty. Nothing could hide that. And yet there was more to this young girl which caused her to stand out. There was a life, a lightness, and a laughter. She would, Eleazar knew, suit Isaac so well. She was how he imagined another must have been like when she was younger. One he still missed so very much. His mother. He watched the girl move, and as she headed down to the spring, spellbound by her grace. Even the way she did the most mundane of tasks, like drawing water and filling her jar, was unique and captivating. In the group of women, she was the bride and the others the maids. But everything about her manner suggested she intended nothing of the sort and would have been horrified if she'd been aware of it. The day's journey had been long and hard, especially for a man of his age. Now, though, all that was forgotten. One look at her and he was energized and invigorated. Eleazar found himself hurrying to meet her as she came up from the spring again. He so wanted her to be the one. Far too much to sit back and simply wait for God to answer his prayer. And yet he also knew that even if he could give the girl every opportunity to fulfill the criteria he'd laid down, he couldn't and mustn't manufacture or manipulate the end result. That was God's call alone. So when he stood before the girl, he did all he could to compose himself and asked, please give me a little water from your jar. The girl's modest but engaging smile immediately broke through all his defences. "Oh, drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. Eleazar needed the refreshment. He had reddened a little due to his dash to her, but a lot more as he saw her close up and heard her voice. Because of his agitation, he spilled more water down his cheeks and he was able to gulp down his throat. But ultimately, wherever the water went, it served its purpose, and the old man was able to regain some of his cool, if only for a moment. The girl giggled at the sight of the old man struggling to pour from the jar into his mouth, and Eleazar reddened again. But then, as quickly as the colour had returned, it drained from his face once more as the girl's next words echoed through his head. "I'll draw water for your camels too," she laughed, and then added almost as an afterthought, "until they finish drinking." Eleazar could no longer respond. He just stood and watched the girl hurry to her task. First, she quickly emptied the jar she was carrying into the trough and then literally ran back down the hill to draw more water. Up and down she went, unaided and yet unstinting, watering every last camel while Eleazar watched on intently. He could scarcely believe it, but could hardly deny it. The girl didn't just fulfill the requirements he'd laid before the Lord, she revelled in them. No one knew a servant heart like Eleazar, and for him this was the noblest beauty of all. The Lord had surely chosen, and he had chosen the very best. Oh, he couldn't resist it. When he'd recovered his wits enough to respond, he went to one of the camel packs and drew out 3 small items. Like a visiting uncle selecting presents with which to indulge a favourite niece, he chose 2 exquisite bracelets and gave them to the girl. The look on her face was a delight to him. She, and all with her, were astonished as well they might be. The service she offered was beyond that expected of her, but certainly not worthy of such gifts. Yet She was obviously a girl who loved gifts and knew how to show her appreciation. First she took them and placed them carefully over her wrists, as though they were the most beautiful things she'd ever seen, let alone possessed. Then she looked up, shyly, with a look equal to 1,000 words. All of which just encouraged Eliezer more, and he held out in his hand a tiny gold nose ring. What it lacked in size next to the bracelets, it more than made up for in its subtle style, and this was a girl who appreciated such style. Her laughter was momentarily stifled by a gasp, and then just a suggestion of a frown crossed her brow, and it was her turn to study the old man. Roles were reversed. She looked him in the eye, and he smiled. His awkwardness was gone, and he could be the respected representative once more. Gently he asked her, "Whose daughter are you?" But she was still dumbfounded by what she'd been given and was unable to respond, as indeed were all those gathered around her. So kindly to help her, Eliezer went on, "Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" He was just beginning to enjoy being back in control when he lost it again. The girl had gathered her senses enough to catch up and answer his first question. "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor." The old man's reaction shocked Rebecca as much as the gifts he'd given her. Never had her name caused consternation. She was a girl. A silly girl, according to her mother, fun, according to her friends, but ultimately just a girl. She couldn't understand his reaction, and she, who was rarely anything other than confident and carefree, felt unusually awkward. It was the old man's turn now to stand shocked and accordingly unresponsive, and Rebecca's turn to try to break the tension of the silence. And as she did, she sought to divert attention from herself and refocus on the mundane. Yeah, we have plenty of straw and fodder as well as room for you to spend the night." If she'd hoped to relieve the awkwardness of the situation, she failed. The old man's response was extraordinary. In answer to the offer of a night's rest, he bowed down before her and began to worship his god. She had no idea what to do, and her friends couldn't help her either. They stood with her while the old man bowed low before them, weeping and crying out, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master, Abraham!" Something stirred in Rebecca. She recognized the name. "Who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on this journey to the house of my master's relatives." Rebecca could take no more. She needed help, and at times like this, she wasn't embarrassed to admit she needed her mother. She turned back and ran to her mother's apartment in Haran, where the household had gathered for the evening meal.
You're listening to the Patriarch podcast. For more information, you can go to BibleNovels.com, where you can become a Patreon supporter to support overseas mission.